Fiji Women's Rights Movement, or FWRM, is a feminist women's rights organization that has at its fundamental ethos of ensuring the removal of all forms of discrimination against women in Fiji, and ensuring that there are ways in which to balance the gender equality scales. And the way we do that is foremostly through policy advocacy. We are strong in terms of our research skills and advocacy skills, where we have had considerable success in policy, legislative, and institutional reform. Hand in hand with that, we have a firm belief that policy, institutional, and legislative advocacy requires strong democracy in our country. And in ensuring that we have a strong democracy, we must enable women to be at the table in terms of decision making. And finally, there's a strong emphasis in intergenerational leadership and movement building. And we, through this area of work, ensure that all the work we do, has the perspectives of diverse women from across Fiji's perspectives and voices involved, and that they are informed of what happens at the seat of power. Before COVID-19, the situation for women in Fiji, not necessarily, if we're looking at the indicators around gender equality, I have to say, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We are talking about fundamental indicators like women in leadership. Yes, we have 20% women in parliament, but however, looking across boards, and even in our parliament, we could be doing a lot better. The indicators around gender-based violence, we have very high statistics around, violence against women, through intimate and non-intimate partners, and correlating that to access to justice for women. We know that it takes women more than 2.5 years to seek justice to the formal justice sector. We're looking at more and more young women come out through tertiary educations, but this has not meant women having quality jobs. So that as a backdrop, we're talking about lack of decision-making opportunities. We're talking about lack of, potential to own property and businesses, etc. We're talking about economics and the role that women play, and the under-recognition of the care work, the unpaid care work that women do. Now, when we put that and juxtapose that with the COVID-19 pandemic situation, we find that all of those areas are, where women's lives intersect. The situation becomes worse off. It's exacerbated. And that is what we are finding ourselves, in right at this moment, where we see that, because of the restrictions on mobility through lockdowns and curfews, because of the way the virus spreads, women are locked in with the perpetrators of violence. How do they access services through the formal justice sector when they need, help urgently? This is where we have seen the helplines, the national helplines, come into, provide the services needed. We see, and we've heard conservative estimates of 120,000 people in Fiji having lost their jobs. And this equates to almost half of the working population in Fiji. Majority of these are women. So we now have a large cohort of women from the tourism sector, from the informal industries, who are without basic income. These are the very same women who are also outside of the social protection and social security mechanisms. So we're talking about insurance. We're talking about having provident funds, pension schemes. Savings in the banks, and having cash transfers given to them. They're not party to that. They are sort of outside the system. So we have a growing number of group of women who we say having lost their employment are part of in the growing number of poor women in Fiji. And their livelihoods are at risk. Associated with livelihoods, we see the impact this has on their health. Our healthcare systems in Fiji need a lot of infrastructural investments and a lot of, I have to say, uplifting to care for the demands of the population. And this is a situation even before the pandemic. With the pandemic, we see, and the focus of our healthcare systems on the pandemic, what has happened to the other areas. We're talking about Fiji having very high rates of NCDs. We're talking about very high rates of cervical cancers and other types of cancers. Are women able to still access medication and services? Where do they go to if they've had cervical or pap smears done and they need to seek additional treatment? Do they have the resources to avail the medication that is much needed for NCD recovery or even management? So we're talking about health interlinked with sexual reproductive health and rights part of it. We see in a situation where in lockdowns or where women have to majority or families have to spend a lot of time at home, what happens to women's reproductive rights, the right to negotiate consensual sex and to have access to contraception, to plan pregnancies, etc. So all of these things matter. And of course, education. We have a situation where there's been a prolonged periods of school closures and, women as the primary caregivers in their home. Now they have an additional burden of making sure that their children are also being provided the, stay-at-home school, teaching, modes. So that is a big concern. And with young women, we find that there's additional burden of having to do a lot more care work. They do not have the access to technology to engage with the online teaching facilities, etc. So how do we manage all of that? And of course, women with disabilities, are completely being sidelined in the conversations we have. So the situation for women during this time in Fiji, we see multifaceted impacts on their lives. Not to say that everything was good before, but with the pandemic, the situation has been exacerbated, grossly. With the pandemic situation, what we have found in Fiji is that with the restrictions imposed, limiting movement, freedom of expression, that has had a direct impact on the human rights of the people, women of Fiji. So the NGO Coalition on Human Rights in Fiji, we have been monitoring the situation in terms of how many people have been charged for breaking the restrictions or the orders for the restrictions that we've had in place, and the numbers are ranging into a few thousands now. What we see is not the same application of power and force by the police. We see, minors being arrested for breaching of, social distancing, orders, or even curfew orders. And we see at a time like this that access to justice for many has been limited, in the sense that not everybody has been able to access lawyers in their defense, or to have the full gamut of their rights when it comes to accessing justice. What we find also in the midst of this is a peaceful student and academic-led protest at our regional university here in Fiji, the University of the South Pacific, which was also curtailed by the police force, where we saw that the restrictions around the COVID-19 pandemic being used as one of the reasons for students not to come together in peaceful protest. So the limitations around fundamental freedoms of association and assembly, is also a grave concern for us. At the same breath, we have seen that there are raids made into certain offices and organizations. There is heavy censorship in terms of what is put out on social media, and again, this all sets in sort of a prevailing environment of intimidation through the authorities in Fiji. And if we are moving towards, rebuilding the country, better, then there needs to be a positive approach to looking at ways in which the people of Fiji, the women of Fiji, are better able to understand the reasons why certain restrictions have been put into place and understand what the repercussions are. A generic application at this point in time does not serve anyone. So this is during these times that human rights and fundamental freedoms, they must be protected and promoted. Even though there are certain risks associated with it. Pandemics do not mean that we live without our human rights. In fact, this is a time when it must be protected.